Episode 8 of Space Prison by Tom Godwin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Space Prison, Episode 8. It was winter of the year 85, and the temperature was 106 degrees below zero. Walter Humboldt stood in front of the ice tunnel that led back through the glacier to the caves and looked up into the sky. It was noon, but there was no sun in the starlit sky. Many weeks before, the sun had slipped below the southern horizon. For a little while, a dim halo had marked its passage each day. Then that too had faded away. But now it was time for the halo to appear again, to herald the sun's returning. Frost filled the sky, making the stars flicker as it swirled endlessly downward. He blinked against it, his eyelashes trying to freeze to his lower eyelids at the movement, and turned to look at the north. There, the northern lights were a gigantic curtain that filled a third of the sky, rippling and waving in folds that pulsated in red and green, rose and lavender and violet. Their reflection gleamed on the glacier that sloped down from the caves and glowed softly on the other glacier, the one that covered the transmitter station. The transmitter had long ago been taken into the caves, but the generator and water wheel were still there, frozen in a tomb of ice. For 3 years the glacier had been growing before the caves, and the plateau's southern face had been buried under snow for 10 years. Only a few woods goats ever came as far north as the country south of the caves, and they stayed only during the brief period between the last snow of spring and the first snow of fall. Their winter home was somewhere down near the equator. What had been called the southern lowlands was a frozen, lifeless waste. Once they had thought about going to the valley in the chasm where the mockers would be hibernating in their warm caves, but even if they could have gone up the plateau and performed the incredible feat of crossing the glacier-covered, blizzard-ripped crags, they would have found no food in the Mockers' Valley, only a little corn the mockers had stored away, which would soon have been exhausted. There was no place for them to live but in the caves or as nomads migrating with the animals. And if they migrated to the equator each year, they would have to leave behind them all the books and tools and everything that might someday have given them a civilized way of life, and might someday have shown them how to escape from their prison. He looked again to the south, where the halo should be, thinking, "They should have made their decision in there by now. I'm their leader, but I can't force them to stay here against their will. I could only ask them to consider what it would mean if we left here." Snow creaked underfoot as he moved restlessly. He saw something lying under the blanket of frost and went to it. It was an arrow that someone had dropped. He picked it up, carefully, because the intense cold had made the shaft as brittle as glass. It would regain its normal strength when taken into the caves. There was the sound of steps, and Fred Schroeder came out of the tunnel, dressed as he was dressed in bulky furs. Schroeder looked to the south and said, "It seems to be starting to get a little lighter there." He saw that it was, a small, faint paling of the black sky. "They talked over what you and I told them," Schroeder said, "and about how we've struggled to stay here this long, and how, even if the sun should stop drifting south this year, it will be years of ice and cold at the caves before big spring comes. If we leave here, the glacier will cover the caves and fill them with ice," he said. "All we ever had will be buried back in there, and all we'll have left will be our bows and arrows and animal skins. We'll be taking a one-way road back into the Stone Age, for ourselves and our children and their children." "They know that," Schroeder said. "We both told them." He paused. They watched the sky to the south turn lighter. The northern lights flamed unnoticed behind them as the pale halo of the invisible sun slowly brightened to its maximum. Their faces were white with near freezing. Then they turned to go back into the caves. "They had made their decision," Schroeder went on. "I guess you and I did them an injustice when we thought they had lost their determination, when we thought they might want to hand their children a flint axe and say, 'Here, take this, and let it be the symbol of all you are or all you will ever be.' Their decision was unanimous. We'll stay for as long as it's possible for us to survive here." Howard Lake listened to Teacher Morgan West read from the diary of Walter Humboldt, written during the terrible winter of 35 years before. "Each morning the light to the south was brighter. On the 7th morning we saw the sun, and it was not due until the 8th morning. It will be years before we can stop fighting the enclosure of the glacier, but we have reached and passed the dead of Big Winter. We have reached the bottom, and the only direction we can go in the future is up." "And so," West said, closing the book, "we are here in the caves tonight because of the stubbornness of Humboldt and Schroeder and all the others. Had they thought only of their own welfare, had they conceded defeat and gone into the migratory way of life, we would be sitting beside grass campfires somewhere to the south tonight, our way of life containing no plans or aspirations greater than to follow the game back and forth through the years. Now let's go outside to finish tonight's lesson." Teacher West led the way into the starlit night just outside the caves, Howard Lake and the other children following him. West pointed to the sky, where the star group they called the Athena constellation blazed like a huge arrowhead high in the east. "There," he said, "beyond the top of the arrowhead is where we were going when the Gurn stopped us 120 years ago and left us to die on Ragnarok. It's so far that Athena's sun can't be seen from here, so far that it will be another 115 years before our first signal gets there. Why is it, then, that you and all the other groups of children have to learn such things as history, physics, the Gurn language, and the way to fire a Gurn blaster?" The hand of every child went up. West selected 8-year-old Clifton Humboldt. "Tell us, Clifton," he said. "Because," Clifton answered, "a Gurn cruiser might pass by a few light years out at any time and pick up our signals. So we have to know all we can about them and how to fight them, because there aren't very many of us yet." "The Gurns will come to kill us," little Marie Chiara said, her dark eyes large and earnest. "They'll come to kill us and to make slaves out of the ones they don't kill, like they did with the others a long time ago. They're awful mean and awful smart, and we have to be smarter than they are." Howard looked again at the Athena constellation, thinking, "I hope they come just as soon as I'm old enough to fight them, or even tonight." "Teacher," he asked, "how would a Gurn cruiser look if it came tonight? Would it come from the Athena arrowhead?" "It probably would," West answered. "You would see its rocket blast, like a bright trail of fire." A bright trail of fire burst suddenly into being, coming from the constellation of Athena and lighting up the woods and hills and their startled faces as it arced down toward them. "It's them!" a treble voice exclaimed, and there was a quick flurry of movement as Howard and the other older children shoved the younger children behind them. Then the light vanished, leaving a dimmer glow where it had been. "Only a meteor," West said. He looked at the line of older children who were standing protectingly in front of the younger ones, rocks in their hands with which to ward off the Gurns, and he smiled in the way he had when he was pleased with them. Howard watched the meteor trail fade swiftly into invisibility and felt his heartbeat slow from the first wild thrill to gray disappointment. Only a meteor. But someday he might be leader, and by then, surely, the Gurns would come. If not, he would find some way to make them come. 10 years later, Howard Lake was leader. There were 350 of them then, and